May 26, 1940. The beaches of Dunkirk, France. A 67-year-old man stands at the helm of a small pleasure yacht, barely 60 feet long, staring across the English Channel at a horizon choked with black smoke. His name is Charles Lightoller. 28 years earlier, he was the senior surviving officer of the Titanic disaster, the man who helped load lifeboats as the great ship sank beneath him. Now, as German artillery shells whistle overhead and Luftwaffe bombers scream down from blood-red skies, he's about to face something even more terrifying. Behind him, across those deadly waters, 400,000 Allied soldiers are trapped like rats in a cage, waiting to die. And Lightoller, along with hundreds of other ordinary British civilians in fishing boats, yachts and tugboats, is sailing straight into hell to save them. This is the story of Operation Dynamo. The story of how Britain's smallest vessels achieved its greatest rescue. The story of 9 days that changed the course of World War II. The story of Dunkirk. The situation in late May 1940 was beyond desperate. It was apocalyptic. Hitler's blitzkrieg had torn through France like a chainsaw through paper. The supposedly impregnable Maginot Line had been bypassed. The French army was collapsing. And the British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian allies, had been driven back to the very edge of Europe, to a small port town called Dunkirk. The German pincers had closed. There was nowhere left to run. The sea was at their backs, and the Wehrmacht was tightening the noose with every passing hour. In Berlin, Hitler was already planning his victory parade. His generals assured him that the British army would be annihilated within days, captured or killed. Britain would have no choice but to sue for peace. The war would be over by summer, but Hitler hadn't counted on one thing. He hadn't counted on the little ships. The British War Office knew the situation was catastrophic. On May 20th, as German tanks rolled to within 10 miles of the Channel coast, cutting off the Allied forces, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay was summoned to an emergency meeting. Ramsay was based in Dover, in a network of tunnels carved into the White Cliffs, tunnels that had been built during the Napoleonic Wars. Now those ancient chambers became the nerve center for what would be called Operation Dynamo, named after the dynamo room in the tunnels where the planning took place. Ramsay's orders were simple and impossible. Evacuate as many men as possible from Dunkirk before the Germans wiped them out. Initial estimates were grim. Maybe 30,000 men could be saved. Maybe. The Royal Navy had destroyers, but Dunkirk's harbor was being pounded to rubble by German artillery and bombers. The beaches were shallow. Big warships couldn't get close. Men would have to wade out into chest-deep water, hoping to be picked up. And all the while, the Luftwaffe would be hunting them like wolves. Ramsay knew he needed more than warships. He needed small boats, lots of them. Boats that could navigate the shallow waters, ferry men from the beaches to the destroyers waiting offshore. And so, on May 14th, even before the evacuation order was given, the British Admiralty had sent out a quiet request. They needed to know what civilian vessels were available. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, barges, lifeboats, anything that could float and make the crossing. The Ministry of Shipping compiled a list. By May 27th, as Operation Dynamo officially began, the call went out. Britain needed her little ships, and they answered. From every port, every harbor, every river and estuary they came. Fishermen from Ramsgate, yacht owners from the Thames, tugboat captains from London's docks. Some were requisitioned by the Navy, crewed by naval personnel. But many others were crewed by their civilian owners, men who had never seen combat. Men who had every reason to stay home, safe with their families. But they didn't. They sailed toward the sound of the guns. Charles Lightoller was one of them. At 67, he had every excuse to sit this one out. He'd already lived through one of history's greatest maritime disasters. He'd served in World War I, commanding a destroyer and ramming a German U-boat. He'd earned his rest. But when the call came, Lightoller didn't hesitate. He owned a motor yacht called Sundowner, a sleek 60-foot vessel he'd used for pleasure cruises along the English coast. On the morning of June 1st, Lightoller, along with his son Roger and a young sea scout named Gerald Ashcroft, fired up Sundowner's engines and set course for Dunkirk. They had no naval escort, no weapons, just a compass, a chart, and a stubborn refusal to let those boys die on that beach. The Channel crossing was 39 miles. In peacetime, it was a pleasant day trip. In May 1940, it was a gauntlet of death. German U-boats prowled beneath the surface. Mines bobbed in the current, waiting to blow unwary vessels to splinters. And above, the Luftwaffe ruled the skies, their Stuka dive bombers screaming down with sirens wailing, dropping bombs with terrifying precision. Lightoller had faced an iceberg. Now he faced the full might of the German war machine. As Sundowner pushed through the waves, the horizon ahead grew darker. Smoke from burning oil tanks at Dunkirk rose in towering black columns, visible from miles away. The sound of explosions rolled across the water like distant thunder. And then, as they drew closer, the full horror of the scene revealed itself. The beaches were black with men. Not hundreds, not thousands, tens of thousands. Soldiers standing in long, snaking lines that stretched from the dunes into the surf, waiting their turn to be rescued. Waiting under the bombs, waiting under the shells, waiting and praying that they'd make it out alive. The Luftwaffe was relentless. Messerschmitt fighters strafed the beaches, their machine guns kicking up geysers of sand and blood. Stuka dive bombers plummeted from the sky, their sirens designed to terrorize, their bombs designed to kill. Ships were hit and sank, taking their precious cargo of men down with them. The destroyer Wakeful was torpedoed by a German E-boat, sinking in 15 seconds and killing 600 men. The French destroyer Burrasque struck a mine and went down with 200 aboard. The sea was a graveyard. But still the little ships kept coming. Lightoller brought Sundowner in close as the shallow draft would allow. Soldiers waded out, chest-deep in the cold water, their uniforms soaked, their rifles held above their heads. They clambered aboard, exhausted, terrified, grateful. Lightoller's yacht was designed to carry 21 people comfortably. On that first trip, he packed in 130 men. They filled every inch of deck space, crammed into the cabin, clung to the railings. The little yacht sat so low in the water that waves lapped over the gunwales. But Lightoller didn't care. He turned Sundowner around and made for the open sea, heading for the destroyers waiting offshore. Once there, the soldiers transferred to the larger ships and Lightoller turned back to the beaches, back to the bombs, back for more. He made trip after trip, ferrying load after load. At one point, a Luftwaffe bomber roared overhead, so close Lightoller could see the pilot's face. But the bombs missed, exploding in the water nearby, sending up plumes of spray that drenched the deck. Lightoller kept going. By the time Sundowner finally limped back to England, Lightoller had rescued 127 men in a single trip, one of the highest counts for a vessel of that size. He'd faced the Titanic. He'd faced U-boats in World War I. And now, at 67, he'd faced the Luftwaffe and won. But Lightoller was just one man, one boat among hundreds. The little ships came in all shapes and sizes, each with its own story. There was Tamzine, a cockle boat from Leon Sea, just 40 feet long, crewed by two fishermen who made multiple trips under fire. There was Medway Queen, a paddle steamer that had once carried holidaymakers on pleasure cruises, now ferrying soldiers and shooting down 3 German planes with her makeshift anti-aircraft guns, earning the nickname Heroine of Dunkirk. There was the fireboat Massey Shaw from the London Fire Brigade, crewed by firemen who navigated minefields and dive bombers to pull men from the water. And there were countless others, nameless, faceless, ordinary Britons doing extraordinary things. A yacht owner from Surrey, a tugboat captain from Liverpool, a fisherman from Ramsgate. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They just did what needed to be done. The conditions on the beaches were nightmarish. Soldiers had been fighting a desperate rearguard action for days, holding off the German advance to buy time for the evacuation. They were exhausted, hungry, out of ammunition. Many had marched for miles, abandoning their heavy equipment, their vehicles, even their rifles, just to reach the coast. Now they stood in those long queues, waiting. The discipline was remarkable. British and French soldiers, side by side, maintaining order even as bombs fell around them. Officers organized the lines, directing men to the boats, keeping panic at bay. But the fear was palpable. Every time a Stuka screamed down, men threw themselves flat in the sand, covering their heads, praying the bombs would miss. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. The sand was stained red. Bodies floated in the surf. And still, the lines moved forward. Still, the little ships came. The Royal Air Force played a crucial role, though it often went unrecognized by the men on the ground. RAF fighter command flew sortie after sortie, Spitfires and Hurricanes dueling with Messerschmitts and Stukas over the channel. The pilots were outnumbered, outgunned, and flying at the very edge of their range. But they fought with ferocious determination, shooting down German bombers, breaking up attack formations, giving the ships and the men on the beaches precious moments of respite. The soldiers didn't always see the air battles happening high above the clouds. All they saw were the bombs still falling. Some cursed the RAF, thinking they'd been abandoned. But the truth was, without the RAF, the slaughter would have been total. The Luftwaffe had expected to annihilate the evacuation fleet. Instead, they were fought to a standstill, losing over 100 aircraft in the battle. It was a Pyrrhic victory for the RAF, but a victory nonetheless. As the days wore on, the pace became frantic. Ramsay's initial hope of saving 30,000 men was shattered. By May 29th, 50,000 had been evacuated. By May 30th, 120,000. The little ships were performing a miracle, but the Germans were closing in. The perimeter around Dunkirk was shrinking. French and British rearguard units fought desperate delaying actions, sacrificing themselves to buy time. The town of Dunkirk itself was a burning ruin, entire streets reduced to rubble, the harbor a twisted mass of sunken ships and shattered piers. And yet the evacuation continued. Destroyers raced back and forth across the channel, their decks crammed with soldiers. The little ships shuttled endlessly between beach and ship, beach and ship, beach and ship. The crews were running on adrenaline and willpower, snatching moments of sleep when they could, then back into the fray. Some boats made a single trip and were sunk. Others made 5, 6, 7 trips, defying the odds, defying the bombs, defying death itself. One of the most harrowing moments came on May 29th, when the destroyer Grenade was bombed and sunk in the harbor. Survivors clung to wreckage, screaming for help as oil fires spread across the water. The little ships raced in, pulling men from the flames, from the debris, from the jaws of death. Another destroyer, Grafton, was torpedoed by a U-boat, splitting in two and sinking within minutes. Again, the little ships were there, plucking survivors from the sea even as German planes strafed the water. The courage required was almost incomprehensible. These were not trained sailors. These were bakers and shopkeepers and fishermen. But they sailed into hell without hesitation. By June 2nd, the situation was critical. The perimeter had collapsed to a thin strip of beach. German artillery was now within direct range, shells slamming into the dunes, into the water, into the ships. The Luftwaffe intensified its attacks, sensing the end was near. Ramsay knew they were out of time. He ordered a final push. Every available ship, every available boat was thrown into the effort. The little ships made one last desperate run. And on the night of June 3rd, the final soldiers were lifted off the beaches. French rearguard troops, who had held the line to the bitter end, were among the last to leave. At 3:40 a.m. on June 4th, the evacuation was declared complete. Operation Dynamo was over. The final tally was staggering. 338,226 men had been rescued. Not the 30,000 Ramsay had hoped for. Not even the 100,000 Churchill had dared to dream of. Over 300,000. It was a miracle, the miracle of Dunkirk. But miracles come at a cost. Over 200 ships had been sunk, including 6 destroyers. Thousands of tons of equipment had been abandoned, tanks, trucks, artillery, rifles. The British Army had escaped, but it had left behind the tools of war. And nearly 70,000 Allied soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured in the fighting. The French troops who stayed behind to cover the retreat were marched into captivity, many spending the rest of the war in German POW camps. Dunkirk was a deliverance, but it was also a defeat. Britain had been driven from the continent. Hitler controlled Europe. Invasion seemed inevitable. Yet, something profound had happened on those beaches, something that transcended the military calculus of losses and gains. The British people had seen their army brought to the brink of annihilation and had refused to accept it. Ordinary men and women, with no military training, no weapons, no protection, had sailed into a war zone and brought their boys home. It was an act of collective defiance, a statement that Britain would not go quietly into the night. Churchill, in his famous speech to Parliament on June 4th, captured the paradox. Wars are not won by evacuations, he said. But there was a victory inside this deliverance. We shall fight on the beaches, he declared. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender. And the British people believed him. Because they had seen what they were capable of. They had seen the little ships. Charles Lightoller returned to England exhausted but unbowed. Sundowner had survived, battered but intact. Lightoller never sought recognition for what he'd done. To him, it was simply duty. He'd been a seaman all his life. When the call came, he answered. That was all. He lived another 12 years, passing away in 1952 at the age of 78. But his legacy, and the legacy of the little ships, endures. Today, many of those vessels still exist, lovingly preserved by their owners, a living link to those 9 desperate days in May 1940. Every year, on the anniversary of Dunkirk, some of them make the crossing again, a pilgrimage to honor the memory of what was achieved. The impact of Dunkirk on the war cannot be overstated. Had the British Expeditionary Force been destroyed, Britain would have been left virtually defenseless. The army that was saved at Dunkirk became the core of the force that would eventually fight its way back across Europe. The officers and NCOs who escaped provided the leadership for the new divisions that were raised. The experience, the knowledge, the sheer bloody-minded determination to win, all of it was preserved. And more than that, Dunkirk gave Britain hope. In the dark days that followed, as the Luftwaffe launched the Blitz and invasion barges massed across the Channel, the British people remembered Dunkirk. They remembered that when things looked darkest, when defeat seemed certain, they had found a way. They had pulled off a miracle, and if they could do it once, they could do it again. Operation Dynamo also had a profound effect on Hitler's strategy. He had expected to crush the British army and force a quick peace. Instead, Britain fought on, alone, defiant. The failure to destroy the BEF at Dunkirk meant that Hitler had to shift his focus. The planned invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, was postponed, then cancelled. Hitler turned east toward the Soviet Union, a decision that would ultimately prove fatal. Dunkirk bought Britain time to rebuild, time to rearm, time to prepare for the long struggle ahead. And in that time, the balance of the war shifted. America entered the conflict. The Soviet Union held at Stalingrad, and the tide began to turn. The little ships of Dunkirk became a symbol, not just of British resilience, but of the power of ordinary people to change history. They were not professional soldiers. They were not trained for war. But when their country needed them, they stepped forward. They faced the bombs and the bullets and the flames, and they did not flinch. They saved an army. They saved a nation. And in doing so, they proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear win. The story of Dunkirk is a story of disaster transformed into deliverance, of defeat turned into defiance, of ordinary men and women achieving the extraordinary. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, not just as history but as inspiration, because it reminds us that even in the darkest moments, even when all seems lost, hope can prevail. Courage can triumph, and sometimes the smallest vessels can carry the greatest burdens. The little ships of Dunkirk sailed into hell and brought back an army. They sailed into history and brought back a nation. And their legacy endures, a testament to the indomitable spirit of a people who refuse to surrender.